Welcome to Wizards of the Tower.
Roleplay.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Is it a gateway drug to RPGs? Welcome to Wizards of the Tower.
Roleplay.
And we're going to talk a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons being a gateway drug to RPGs.
I've heard it referred to that. I've heard it referred to that as, it's a gateway drug. It leads you into these pathways. Usually they talk about that with regards to the satanic panic, though.
It's a gateway drug to the satanic panic.
Next thing you know, and you're sacrificing cats.
Sacrificing children.
Yeah.
Sacrificing your neighbor.
Yeah.
Sacrificing a steak.
Yeah. So, D&D is so popular now. I would never have predicted it, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, it's everywhere. The movies, the games.
Talking about
TV
on TV.
On TV. Well, we can always bring up and say, did Stranger Things really create a rebirth of D&D?
Or did Big Bang Theory?
Or Big Bang Theory, where they played D&D.
Or there were a couple other shows that were kind of like that too.
In a sense, popular culture has made D&D more acceptable. All right. I listened to an article on the radio a few days ago, and they were talking about a video game museum, and that the original video games came out in the early 70s, and they were really starting to get popular in the 80s and 90s. That's, essentially people who have played those are in their 60s and 70s now.
Yeah.
So, D&D came out in the late 70s. The people who originally...
Actually, it came out in the earlier than that.
It did.
But the books came out in...
Right, but the popular aspect of it came out, mid to late 70s.
Yeah.
So, the people who started playing it, essentially, are in their 60s and 70s now.
Or some of them even in their 80s, depending upon how old they were when they started.
Yeah. So the thing is now it's become, it's such a deep part of our culture that, you just can't deny its existence, and you just can't marginalize it like people used to do all the time.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of times when you tell people that you're getting together with your group to play RPGs, a lot of times you reference Dungeons and Dragons, even though you might be playing something completely different, because everyone knows Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, everyone knows D&D. It's got such a cultural footprint that all you have to do is mention it, and people are like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, my son wants to do that. My daughter's into that. Or
I used to play that in the early 80s when I was in high school.
And the thing is in the United States now, we're kind of, even if we're growing up and getting old, we're still kind of kids. We're still kind of children. With our love of race cars and sports and music and fantasy TV shows, we're still kind of caught up in that fantasy world that we like to use, and we like to, use as an escape from our harsh reality. So, it just goes to show that, D&D, along with so many other things, would be such a, woven into our cultural fabric.
Right. It is a great intro to RPGs. It's a stepping point, because you get into Dungeons and Dragons, and then you step off into Old World Essentials, or Dragonbane, or One Ring, or Traveler, or whatever. That was a lot of where I came from. We started off with Dungeons and Dragons, and then we jumped into Top Secret, and Boot Hill, and Gamma World, and Pendragon, and all the other games that were out around that time that started coming out, Tunnels and Trolls and RuneQuest. And
so here's the thing: can we argue that D&D is probably the most popular role-playing game?
Yeah,
I would think we can, because not only it has lasting power and staying power, but its cultural identity. Just about everybody that you run up against in the United States, if they haven't been living in a bunker up in Idaho for 40 years, know about D&D. All right? In one way or the other, whether it's good or bad, it still has a cultural, fixation for that. So, and of course, if it's the most popular, then is it the most dominant?
It's definitely the most dominant.
Yeah.
You know, and the whole thing too with popularity, even with, so kind of a story is our local gaming store. They pretty much only carry Dungeons and Dragons books. They don't carry a lot of the other game books. I mean, yeah, there's a few, but you walk in there and there's just shelves and shelves and shelves of Dungeons and Dragons books, and you ask them, well, why don't you carry this? Well, it doesn't sell. Because everybody wants to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
But if people would have these other options, and they would have those options as a gaming option inside their store when they have games, then they would probably expand, and it might become more popular.
I mean, that's a
and also become more prominent too. Other games would become more prominent.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it's all about exposure. You know, it's exposure. Yeah. It's like, you know, in the United States we have other, you know, really kind of popular games. We have Warhammer, either Old World or 40K, which is really big. And then we have, you know, Mech Warriors, and we have BattleTech and that kind of stuff, which is really, really big.
Starting to get real popular, yeah.
Yeah, and that, so, you know, when it comes down to tabletop stuff, you know, there's a certain prominence there. You know, it isn't just one huge tabletop game that, you know, rules them all. You know, D&D, you know, has a lot of competitors. They really do. They've got Pathfinder, which is a big competitor for D&D.
Yep.
You know, there's others, Dragon's Bane, there's all sorts of...
School Essentials, there's Shadow Dark now.
There's all sorts.
Morkborg.
And, you know, there always was. There was Shadowrun, there was other, you know, games like that people have. You know, and they would sometimes give D&D a run for its money. It's arguably that they don't have the cultural impact, even though they may have the same kind of content. They might not have the same kind of cultural impact that D&D does. And I would argue, and I think you might agree, that D&D has benefited from things like the Satanic Panic.
Oh, yeah.
More so than it became a detriment to it. Because, you know, you forbid something and everybody wants it. So that's kind of how it worked.
Yeah, and you could arguably say, too, that most people that are playing RPGs started off with Dungeons and Dragons. And then maybe they said, well, we don't like this system, we're going to jump to this other system. You know, whether it be RuneQuest or Rules, what's that other one? Rules, it's slipping my mind.
I mean, you could say that, you know, in my personal experience, I started out role-playing games with D&D, 3.0.
3.5.
3.0 or 3.5. I can't remember which one we started. Was it 3.5? And so Delaney got me into it as we were, you know, and I remember in high school that we tried to play an earlier version of D&D, but it just didn't really work. But that was my introduction. Now, I knew about other games, but people really didn't talk about them that much. You know, there was Gamma World, which was the big one, you know, about mutants and stuff like that. And the thing is, you know, being a child of the Cold War and seeing the movies on TV about atomic mutants, it was something very familiar to us, you know, that you would have mutations and monsters and things like that. It wasn't anything, you know, completely unusual.
Yeah.
So, but it made more sense that when we did start to get into playing D&D, you know, that we would start out in, you know, in the D&D world itself and work our way forward, kind of like a lot of people do.
Yeah. Then you add in the culture, interpretation, and popularity of it. You know, in Europe, you know, that's where a lot of fantasy really got its going. So while Dungeons and Dragons may not have been the game, there were other systems that were similar.
Yeah.
Because maybe they couldn't get the books and they heard about this game and somebody over there created it. Because we do know that Games Workshop was a publisher and started some of their own systems. They had the White Dwarf magazine, and they kind of carried on their own system. In fact, they created the whole Fiend Folio.
I know, it's funny because I didn't realize that until I read some of those books about Gary Gygax, that they talk about the relationship between Games Workshop over in England and how popular their books were selling over there. And, you know, there's been a few English writers who have written books about their obsession with D&D and their playing it and how it became an absolute obsession for them as they played it. You know, and they became just as entranced with it as we did over here. Now, I don't know how many languages D&D is translated into, but I'm guessing that there's a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why it does work so well worldwide, okay, is it pulls in all sorts of cultural affiliations from all over the world.
Right.
With its gaming system.
Yeah, because you had Oriental Adventures, which took the Japanese and Chinese side of it. You had there was an Arabic side of it. There was the Spelljammer, which was kind of a space age.
Yeah, you've got a way. I mean, even in the new sort of D&D, you've got like African references, Aztec references, Asian references.
Yeah, Azteca was a realm inside of the Dungeons and Dragons. It was the New World, and it was very Aztec, Mayan, and Incan.
Yeah, there's Arabic references, there's Middle Eastern references, there's all sorts of things. And the funny thing is culturally, if you want to play a game like that, you can work it in to where it works with your particular culture.
Yeah, well, even they added in some of the mythos, Baba Yaga.
Yeah, there you go.
Which is Eastern European, Slavic, and Russian.
So it works well for all ages, what you're talking about, that you can essentially make it G rated all the way up to X rated if you want. It only kind of, depends on how far you want to go with it. And it works for all cultures. And I would argue that in a lot of ways, D&D works for almost all races too, because they've gotten to the point where they're starting to include all sorts of people in the books, with all the racial identities that people have, and all the mixed racial identities, all the people who don't conform to one race or another.
Yeah.
You can almost find a home in D&D because you're like, well, I'm biracial, or this person's bicultural. Well, in D&D, you can be like that too.
Yeah, and then with age, there were a lot of the people that I started gaming with that I taught had a game that weren't even 10 years old, and I think the game was designed for 12 plus. My own boys wanted to play, and I handed them the 3.5 rule book, and I said, "You want to play? You're gonna read a couple pages in this book, and then you're gonna explain to me what you read, and if you can explain to me, you can play." And I think they were 9 at the time, and they did it. And I would tell them things, what's your stats? Here's your stats. What do they mean? And they could explain it to me. So I said, okay, I guess you're ready to play. And I know that there's younger players out there than even that.
Yeah. I mean, it is a game for people who I would think would be sort of mature when it comes on to the intellectual level. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of tables. There's a lot of dice rolling. There's math. There's behavioral aspects of it. You have to keep track of what you're doing. You have to keep track of all your characteristics and your value systems. It is a game for mature players, but that doesn't mean that people can't play it when they're younger and mature into playing it. I mean, Delaney's just talked about how well her kids were able to play into it, and that makes complete sense. And I've heard about people who've introduced their children to playing the game when they were young, and they sort of grew into it, and they got better and better if they took it seriously enough. And it all depends on how seriously you're going to take it too.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit easier now with the additions than what they were previous.
Yeah,
because it was a lot more complex back then. I think the game was a lot easier and more attractive to people than what it ever used to be. Because it used to be considered, the brainiacs, nerds, and geeks that played it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so we could talk about that too, and I suppose just about anybody who's watching this would look at this and think, okay, do you need like the theater of the mind to play it? And I would argue that yes, you do. Now, we know that there's a lot of people who cannot conceive of abstract thoughts or fantasy events within their head. They don't dream properly, or they can't conceive of an abstract realm. Everything is concrete to them, and that's it. So would they do well in the game? I would say probably not. It works very, very well for people who have fantastical imaginations.
Yeah.
Creative individuals, intelligent individuals, people who can conceive of a world beyond theirs. That's what the game feeds from, and that's what it kind of expands upon.
And then you take the fact that Dungeons and Dragons is infinitely flexible, moddable, and open-ended. We have a game system that was a 5th edition that's based upon the Revolutionary War. You play characters in the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
There's one coming out that is Neanderthal or Neolithic. Neanderthals are just one of the races that you can play.
Wow.
So those are options, and I see all these options all the time on Kickstarters. That you can get in. Somebody has modded for this type of a game system, or this kind of a game system. Pirates, Pirate Borg, in fact, has a 5e side of it that you can get the books in to take all the rules for pirates and put them into your 5e game.
Man, I mean, it's very moddable, and you can very, very adaptable. And we're not going to talk about other games. We're just going to keep our eyes focused on D&D because that's how it kind of works. But it's very flexible when it comes to all sorts of actions, all sorts of cultures, all sorts of dynamics, and it's completely open-ended. It's not one of those closed-ended games where, oh, it's fun for the entire family. It takes 4 to 6 hours to play, and then that's it. It's like you can keep coming back to D&D for years and keep going in a realm. It's like a movie that you continually keep playing, and that has sequel after sequel after sequel after sequel.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so successful, in my opinion, as a game.
And what you said, we're not going to talk about other games. Pathfinder is originally based upon Dungeons and Dragons. It was considered 3.75.
Yeah. Well, what I meant was essentially is that when we talk about bringing other games modding out of D&D, Pathfinder's one is kind of like a parallel universe. That it basically has a lot of the same characteristics as D&D. I lump it into the same broad category of RPGs.
Right. In fact, a lot of times when we say, to people, what are you doing? Well, we're going to be playing Dungeons and Dragons. We're really playing Pathfinder.
Yeah.
I'm kind of the exception. I'll say, I'm playing Pathfinder, and they'll look at me kind of funny, and I said, it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I mean, most people know, when they ask me, it's like, I just say, yeah, I've got my strategy game tonight. And they're like, oh, what game is that? And I'm like, well, yeah, it's D&D. Oh, okay. And I don't really want to just blare, because I don't want to spend 15 minutes explaining the difference between Pathfinder and D&D. Yeah. But really, most people understand what it is, and what goes into creating a game and playing it. So there's again that cultural identity where if you mention it and people know, it's like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that game. My cousin plays it, or I played it a couple times, or something like that.
My husband used to play it, or whatever.
Yeah.
Somebody who's probably played it.
Sure.
Whether you know it or not.
Yeah, in that sense, I'd say it's probably the most successful RPG. Yeah. And I hope, despite everything that's happening with the games and the companies, I hope it remains an extraordinarily successful RPG. And the reason I say that is because human beings need that creative output. We need that way to fit into our fantasy realm.
And as long as it exists, it branches off to other games.
Yeah.
Now, there are those influencers that, and they're influencers because that's how they make their living.
Oh yeah.
Is Dungeons and Dragons.
Sure.
And they don't want to talk anything but Dungeons and Dragons. Instead of talking about other RPGs or going out and exploring other RPGs. And I think we've said this in the past. Explore other RPGs. Use it as your gateway, as your start, to your fantasy or science fiction adventures, and branch out from there to see what else is there. Don't be afraid to expand upon playing Dungeons and Dragons or Role Master. That's what I was thinking.
Role Master,
Role Master or RuneQuest or Warhammer, whatever it is. Use it as your start, and then branch out. Find what interests you, because there's really a lot of systems out there that are very simple.
Oh yeah, and people of course are creating games now that are a lot more simple, easier to get into.
Doing them online.
Yeah, and online gaming is another thing. I mean, that's a new phenomenon that we started talking about. When people started doing it, it really blew up over COVID because people didn't want to be in the same room together. The popularity of games like this have really become integral to our cultural functioning within our world.
Yeah,
it really has. It's become part of us, just like our sports, our movies, our music, our TV shows. So I mean, why not partake of it? It could lead you anywhere, and I would say go for it. For people who are adventurous with adventurous spirits, go for it.
Yeah. So I think we're going to end this episode of Wizards of the Tower
Roleplay. Don't
forget to like, share, subscribe, spread the word, follow us on Discord. Don't forget to ring the bell because then you get notifications. Leave a comment. We'll always reply to your comment, even if it's just a simple, hey, thanks for commenting. We do appreciate those people who do comment or who like us. If you're a troll and just want to dislike us because of what we believe or who we are, then go away. We don't want you. We're small fish. So anyway, may all your adventures be epic.
And keep on rolling.
Thanks, folks. Welcome to Wizards of the Tower.
Role play.
This episode, we're going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Is it a role playing? Is it a gateway drug? I can do it.
Okay.
3, 2, 1.